we're going to go ahead and get started, and people are getting snacks. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Teny Gross is the Executive Director of the Institute for the Study and Practice of Nonviolence, a pioneering organization that teaches the principles and practices of nonviolence locally, nationally, and internationally. He's a recipient of an Institute of Global Leadership Alumni Award from Tufts University, where he earned his BFA. He received his MTS degree from Harvard Divinity School and a fellowship in strategic perspective and nonprofit management from Harvard's Business School. Prior to the Institute, Teny was a program coordinator for the Ella J. Baker House Youth Focused Community Initiative, a participant in the National 10-Point Coalition, and a senior street worker for the city of Boston. I'll leave it at that.
Sure, thank you.
Very much.
And I'll stand, so you won't have to look behind other people to see me. I apologize for my casual dress, but I have a really nice dress shirt and a jacket in the car, but then I said, it's too late for my looks. You came probably to hear my story. So I'm kind of glad I did. It's hot. So I'm going to speak for a while. Feel free anytime to interrupt me with questions. And this talk is geared more about sort of a personal story as well, so I'll mix both the work with the personal story. So before I forget, I bought this book today. Charles Cobb was one of the SNCC, Student Nonviolence Organizing, that many people. That's the group that really inspired me initially. It's through a photographer named Danny Lyons who photographed SNCC. And this is a new book. This nonviolent stuff will get you killed, which is what he heard in the South when they were doing it. We hear it now from gang members all the time. The same dilemma. If you disarm yourself, you won't be able to face your opponents. So I'm looking forward to reading that. And I just bought it today. I thought you might be interested. But these are hardcore organizers. He's still at it. He occasionally spends time at Brown University. I think 2 years ago there was the 50th anniversary, right, of the reunion. So
this summer.
This summer? See, I'm really bad with dates. But some of them came to Brown University, and it was kind of amazing to see the one group of my heroes, really courageous people. And this school, which was my first stomping ground, that's why I came to the United States, actually BU School of Business, believe it or not, business school. I thought since my parents never finished high school because of World War II, I didn't think I can afford to study something more practical. I thought if I go to college, I might as well do something that will earn me a living. But pretty quickly, the philosophy professors here and the art professors here and literature teachers here kind of conspired and said, Teny, you really don't belong in the business school. And they shifted me to the museum school, not far from the Fenway, actually in the Fenway. And that's how I ended up getting a degree from the museum school and from Tufts. So this was my first place, right here at Commonwealth Avenue. I remember the cold winter with the snow blowing right on the avenue, right? It still does it, I think. As much as the place looks a lot nicer now, I'm sure it still is a wind tunnel. And it's great to be back here because also, of course, Martin Luther King went here. I hope you all checked in the library. There's a good collection of his stuff and what he was doing when he was here. And I think at some point I read some essays of what he was doing as a young clergy person here in Boston. So I'll start with my roots. I am a quarter Serbian Greek Orthodox. That's my father. My maternal grandfather is a Greek Orthodox Serb, was. He married his arch enemy, which is a Catholic Austrian from Vienna, who was an artist. And then they produced two daughters, one was a Catholic, and the oldest one, which was my mother, was a Greek Orthodox. She then went on to make another cardinal sin and married a Croatian Jew. So if you look at the last 100 years of wars, world wars, my family was involved in producing them, between the Serbs and the Croats, between the Jews and the Greek Orthodox and the Catholics. A lot of European violence was produced. My father's mother was killed in Auschwitz, probably. Those who were killed in Auschwitz actually immediately were not listed in Auschwitz. Those who are listed in Auschwitz, actually those who were selected, the 10%, to die by slave labor. So the 90% who got on the train and immediately killed within an hour or two actually are not listed in Auschwitz. So we think either the collaborators, the Catholic collaborators in Croatia killed her, or she was killed in Auschwitz. And I was fortunate 2 years ago on a grant. I went with the Zen Peacemakers. That's an organization you should check out. They're in Western Mass, Buddhists. They do pilgrimages to Auschwitz, to Rwanda, and I'm probably leaving 2 more places, but they're now in Auschwitz. Because my Armenian roommate, Eric, I'm thinking, posting on Facebook, that they just arrived in Auschwitz. But they do a week in Auschwitz, which is very powerful. Most people do 2 hours, you know. And we went there there were Palestinians, there were former guards, Lithuanians, there was children of Nazis, there were children of Dutch freedom fighters, there were Native Americans. It was a great group, about 100 people spending a week together in Auschwitz, meditating, and just absorbing it. It was very powerful. So since I'm on there, let me tell you actually how the brain works in odd ways. The first night after we visited where the crematorium actually survived, which is the first crematorium, the more basic camp, not the ones that were built later in Birkenau, which were bigger. I left the room, the hostel room, and took a walk. It was about 9 at night, and walked around that part of the camp. It was the first night, and it is odd things that actually make reality real for us. And what broke me down, so I walked around the camp, saw the barbed wires, I saw the towers of the guards, and it's, you know, it has some impact. Then I crossed the street and walked towards sort of a little forest, and got my eyes to get used to some darkness. And suddenly there were dogs barking. And that broke me down crying. Because what I remembered as a kid, the stories, what got you discovered were the dogs. So if you are one of the very, very few who managed to escape, it's the dogs who got you discovered. And so that was an odd thing. Obviously those dogs who were barking when I was there were not even closely alive when this happened. The next morning I went for a run, and another part of the reality really hit me. And it was so foggy, because it's a valley. Went running, you can literally see from here maybe to the end of the room, right? Really, really short distance. So you don't really see much. You run in the fields, very peaceful and quiet. I think it was like 5:30 in the morning or 6. And suddenly another sound that is to me the Holocaust was trains. Suddenly I could hear the trains. Another odd piece of biography is that my great-grandparents, so on my Jewish side, got married in Auschwitz in 1899. So I thought it was always a small village, that just what a coincidence that 50 years before the Holocaust, part of my family got married there. But it turns out it was always an important train junction for business. So the Germans selected it because of that. But I'm bringing those 2 stories because sometimes it's not really the big pictures or the history, but it's really sometimes it's sounds and smells that bring us to reality with our ancestors. I had a big, very moving pieces while we were there, where we were in the mothers' barrack. That's the pregnant mothers that were camped, and most of them got killed. And there was a Polish woman who was sang French chansons, but she sang a song in Hebrew. And the Native Americans sang, did a flute, which was so powerful. Just the loneliness of the sound of the flute in that environment. And I think everyone felt very close. We were in a very tight barracks, all of us, and that was a really impactful evening. But there were some others. But an argument started there. A lot of the people who were there were upset at how the Israelis were visiting Auschwitz. Came with flags, very noisy, kind of 2 hours, we're here. And a lot of the non-Israeli, I mean, in our group there were really no Israelis, I think, beside me, and a Palestinian Israeli. And then he was married to a Palestinian, was not an Israeli. But we would see who was coming, which groups were coming. And mainly the Dutch and other people were really upset at how in such a holy place, kind of death, the Israelis were with flags and very... so a debate started. So I very quietly at the end said, you know, there's a reason I didn't go to Auschwitz with the Israelis. I really wanted to be with the universal group and not sort of as a stand. But I said, you know, it is, I did, and I'm a non-nationalist, I don't have flags. And my parents are dead, and one night when I was alone in one of the barracks, I took out my passport and I photographed it with my iPhone. Because it is quite amazing that we're alive and around after this. And I said, you know, we gotta be understanding of the mindset that I was born to as an Israeli, that it won't happen to us again, and we will be active, and we won't let other people decide our future. And there is a power in that. There's a power in that kind of a resurrection. As much as it's not popular outside of Israel, and it's a my country is a problematic country. There's something very powerful about that. So I was born and I grew up. I'll start with that. My father left in '49. His only surviving relative was his sister. She immigrated to Palestine, became Israel. He immigrated in '49, the year after the establishment of Israel. And my mother knew him for maybe a week. That was a way for her to get out of communism. He said, why don't you marry me through the mail? If it works out, you stay in Israel. Doesn't work out, you go to Canada. Thank God you stayed, because I wouldn't have been here. But young people after the war, after a lot of losses, sometimes do those very quick sort of let's get together. And that's not unusual. So I grew up in Israel. Loved Israeli history. I loved the idea of standing for ourselves. Very inspired by these stories. I was very angry with the British, because the stories we learned were that we, after the Holocaust, were not allowed to come sneak in boats of survivors. And I was very inspired by, you know, I loved airplanes that were military airplanes, like a lot of kids. Watched war albums. But my family also raised me on literature, on humor. So those things are often not contradictory. And they were afraid actually that I will be an Israeli chauvinist. You know, they want to make sure that you can love your country and you can love your people and all of that. Don't be embarrassed about it. But also don't just become a nationalist. So I think that was definitely in the education. I think another thing, when I ended up coming here eventually at Harvard studying under some Jesuits, I really felt inadequate, and I felt how we are not very smart people. I know it comes on because we're constantly people are pumping into our heads that Jews are very smart. A, that's not true. I grew up with them, so I can make those jokes. But the thing that I really saw there was is we were taught to love our thinkers that we have, and I think often here we go. It's very difficult for certain groups to know and study their own thinkers. They don't have to be the best of the best. For 2,000 years we didn't run anything. So our thinkers in many ways are not as great, but we learned many, we really were taught a lot of our heritage and all kind of obscure rabbis, etc., and the love of knowledge. And I think that was very powerful. Also in Israel, and then I'll jump to the United States. Every year, 1 week, the whole country closes down and we have book fairs. Every city has a book fair. And that's something I would highly recommend for this society, since our kids just don't read enough. And the work I do now in Providence and work around the country, a lot of it will be solved if we would read early on to our children. You know, it is the level of, when I was a street worker in Boston, I was asked in Franklin Field housing project, Teny, how many kids you got? I said 300. I said, no, how many kids you got? I said, I got nothing. I don't have kids. I couldn't be doing this work if I had kids. And I thought at the time intervening in high school age groups is perfectly fine. Then I had my own 2 children in Providence, really. I mean, the first one was born here in Boston, but we then moved. It is frightening how quickly kids get knowledge if you read to them, the vocabulary, etc. And now I'm educated as a parent. You got to start up very, very early. So from that, I came to Boston to study. I was going to be an Athenian, right? I'm jumping on the period I'll go back on, but I kind of went long-winded on my European piece, which I never do. But I served in the Israeli army. I was a sergeant. I spent time in the occupied territories. I spent time in part of Lebanon. And then I lived for 2 years in London. And my sister lived here in Boston, and she invited me to come, and that's why I ended up studying here. I never had intentions of coming here. And when I got the opportunity to be at BU and then at the museum school, I really thought I'm not going to get involved with any of your issues, since I survived a lot of mine, and I thought this is my chance to be in the books. By temperament, I'm verbal, I'm impatient, so I really need all the calm that I could get. So I didn't want to get in any issues. However, my first year here, the Charles Stewart case happened near Mission Hill, outside of Brigham and Women's Hospital. And basically he called from a cell phone in a car, Boston police. He said, a black man just shot my pregnant wife. And I was at the time just down the street on Huntington Avenue at the museum school. And I would see the police, and I would get home and watch the news, and there were men in rows in Mission Hill housing projects being searched. And it kept on going and going. Both the mother and the baby, as far as I remember, were alive for a little bit, and they died at separate times. So I think it became a national story. And as much as I wanted, I think I couldn't ignore it. You know, it was right by our school. And so I had a friend in City Hall, and I asked him at some point, I was doing documentary photography, and I said, I want to get and photograph how the police treats people. I want to drive with the police. I was dead naive, right? I was like, I want to come with my camera and drive how the police treats people. But as I was researching it, I thought to myself, it's just going to be playing catch you. And I come from a country where conflicts are about getting the other side. It's about what the other side does wrong. And I asked him, let's do a different tack. Is anyone doing something positive? And he asked his boss, and he says, there's this little-known minister, Pentecostal minister. He might be doing something interesting. And he took me to Freedom House in Roxbury, and we met. And we didn't promise each other nothing. I said, I have a camera, I am a capable photographer. If you let me, I'll hang out with you and learn about what you do. He says, fine, you can come. And a few months later, there was a stabbing during a funeral, Morning Star, on Blueville Avenue. That's why I met Mariama's father. 3 fathers that became very influential in my life. Reverend Eugene Rivers, who I ended up working for, Reverend Hammond, and Reverend Brown. The trio that helped change this city. At the time, Boston had 152 homicides. I had no idea, as a foreigner who was pretty clueless, I walked into the height of American crime. It was the crack epidemic, 89, 1991. It was horrific. I used to show up at midnight on a bicycle with a Nikon camera in the middle of drug dealing territory, right? And the guy says, yo, MF, you better be trying to sell it. And I said, I had a stubborn Serbian-Israeli mind. I was like, don't even try. But we had someone that had an impact on us as well, the churches as well as myself. His name was Selvin Brown. He was a drug dealer. He was born the same year as I was born. And he used to take the ministers, the pastors, on walks in the neighborhood. And he used to tell them, and us, let me tell you why I win and you lose for the hearts of the kids. He says, you, the churches, are here on Wednesday and Sunday. I'm here in the morning when Johnny goes to school. I'm here in the afternoon when he comes back to school. I'm here when Mom sends him to get from the corner store some milk, and I give him $1. That's all it takes. I win, you lose. If you want to win, you better change your presence here. And to the credit of those 3 ministers, they moved to the neighborhoods. And that was the big difference, right? There were maybe 200 ministers, imams, rabbis who came after the Morning Star. And the 3 pastors who created the Temperance Coalition with another pastor, actually Bruce Wall, they said most people won't come back. Now, I was 23, I had really no idea, so organizing or any of that, but I was just absorbing this. They said most people won't come. So one of the important lessons, if you're going to be doing organizing, or some of you have, is the story of Gideon in the Bible, right? There were 3,000 people who came to volunteer for a war, and he said he sent 90% of them back. He kept 10%. At one point, years later, when the Temperance Coalition became famous, I remember Reverend Rivers gave a talk at Harvard to the Black Student Alliance. They were all excited, they all wanted to change the world, and Reverend Rivers looked at me on the side and said, if one of them comes to Dorchester, we'll be lucky. And I thought, my God, you're so cynical. But he was so right. There was one guy, Jean Moreau. He's the only one who came. So that's true. You can inspire people, you excite them, and you need that when you build movement, but what we don't teach in Ashoka and SCORE, all these innovation awards, is actually we don't teach stamina and we don't teach long term. We need to pick up a page from the Japanese, 500 years planning. Nothing happens fast. So the one thing we had working for us in Dorchester, things were bad like anywhere else, we felt the size of Boston was a bit more manageable. We knew, everyone knew at the time, you would see it was nightly on the news, New York, Chicago, the Bronx was so tough, Baltimore, LA was insane. In Boston, we didn't know what's going to be the solution, but we felt the size was a little bit more manageable. And then at some point, even the Jews got involved with Boston Freedom Summer. They said, there was a new leader, Nancy Kaufman, for the JCRC, and she said, we used to work together. Those 2 communities used to work together. Why are we separate? They put an injection of support, and Boston Freedom Summer was revived, and we did a lot of great work. And people came from Oberlin and other places, and was really exciting. A lot of young faces, just doing simple stuff. Just showing love and teaching in the summers and connecting, and it made a difference. Sal, meanwhile, I used to work at Chestnut Hill at the Ralph Lauren store at Filene's. I got to learn a lot about America that way as well. Really do. I'm not kidding. But I'll tell you a story about drug dealing and bartering. So one day, someone comes and grabs 10 suede coats that we're talking about, like this is like $15,000 worth of merchandise. Run, the alarms are ringing. I'm chasing him. He's an older, kind of crumpled guy, looks semi-homeless. Runs, jumps into a car. I tell to the cop, look, they're right here. He's like, where? Where? He's not trying to do anything. I get summoned to the manager's office. And she's sitting in me and looking at me like, Teny, listen, this is the last time you're doing this. I said, but why? She said, Teny, the last thing we want is you getting shot and suing the company. I was like, the coats, they're insured. We pass that cost to you. People are buying it. It's all covered. It's like, Teny, you clearly don't understand this culture. I says, what about the cop? She says, he's here really to make people from Chestnut Hill feel like there's security. He's not getting shot. He's 3 years from retirement. This whole system feeds itself. So that night, I'm in Four Corners in Dorchester with Sal. And he had this West Indian laugh, booming laugh, right? It was my height, but bigger. And he was laughing at how naive I am. I said, Teny, look. And in the cupboard were some of those clothes. He said, Teny, I never need to leave the neighborhood. It all comes to me. And I said, you know, and he used to have in a row like 20 Adidas shoes. In Four Corners, you could not walk with Nike. You would get beaten. That's right. And he had the silk shirts from Filene's and black Guess jeans, right? I said, but it all looks like a uniform. It's not like you have a lot of selection. And I have a bit of an aversion to communism since my parents escaped from that. He had the same clothes. But I said, but what if this guy gets arrested? Because he said, Teny, this guy's my customer. He says he gets released very quickly. He's in a withdrawal. They go crazy. The cops don't want to stay with him all night. He'll be pretty quickly bailed out. And this system continues to support itself. So you see, you even at Filene's can learn about American economy and bartering and drug dealing, wherever you stand. One night, Sal took me to photograph in a crack house. I still have those photographs. I had a camera in my chair. It was a bulky camera, but I made it to bring it in. Today, it's a lot easier with cell phone, etc. But this was a Nikon. And we walk out. And we just walked out of a crack house of him selling drugs, me photographing him. And suddenly these big two guys grab him and throw him against the car. It was a Crown Victoria. I didn't know at the time that's the gang unit. So when I realized it, I see they have guns, I see they had their badges, etc. But they were dressed like me. I was like, wow, that's it, he's gone. I don't really know how to get back. It was like midnight. I know now it was Upham's Corner, but at the time I didn't know at the time the geography that well. 5 minutes later, he's being released. I was like, Sal, we just walked out from a crack house. You had money and product. How come you're free? And he laughed again. And he took me to an abandoned cement frame where I stood close by of a bank. And he picked up those Pepsi caps. And the product was in them. As he walked out, he saw them. And he managed to somehow slide it on the window pane. And they never found anything on him. He was very skilled. I realized the skill he has. Fast forward, the churches moved him to the sides. They negotiated with the FBI. He went to a religious college. which cost us a fortune, myself included. I was only living on the salary of Filene's because of his collect calls. And that's when I really saw again. You might take him out of the hood, but he had no friends in his new college. It's very hard to uproot a tree. Very often we want to move young people for safety, but they really struggle in a new environment that is different. It's a different environment, you know. He had an AK-47, a Kawasaki, he had everything he needed come to him in the neighborhood. He was the king of his neighborhood. He couldn't move very far. Before I got involved with the churches, I was sort of the house photographer at Wally's, the jazz club that you might know. And one night we tried to take him there, and literally we're in the car outside. He says, Teny, I cannot go in there. I don't know if I'm going to run into someone. It's going to end up badly. I said, Sal, isn't it so sad that you make so much money, you have so much of an intellect, but you're really closed within your own four corners neighborhood? And then he would come back in the summers, and then one Friday, he and I were talking. It was a sunny day, it was a nice summer day. We were in Four Corners, we were talking. He said, Teny, it's too late for me, but save those young kids. And you know, I wasn't sure where he was going with that. And then said, Teny, he was on a bicycle. He said, Teny, I'm going to get some weed, I'll be right back. I said, no, you won't. He said, yes, I will. No, I won't. And we kind of talked, and he went to get his weed. And the next day I got a call that he died speedballing. He mixed heroin and cocaine, and it stopped his heart. And that was one of those, that was another junction. We have junctions in our lives, right? I had absolutely no intention to do the work that I do now, right? Excuse me. I come from another world. I'm not under any illusions. And the fact that I was involved in the summers, it was great. But, you know, I know I'm going to graduate. I'm not a citizen. I'm on a visa, etc. And, you know, this is not my country. But his death was one of those moments that really had me think deeper about, you know, I wrote a piece about him then. I think I read it in a circle, right? And I broke down, but really compared him to a Warsaw Ghetto warrior, kind of a freedom fighter. Just under different circumstances, it could have been me instead of him. And he taught me a lot. He taught a lot of the churches about what it is that is going on. And summer later, when I taught photography to young people who came out of juvenile jail here in Boston, our gang members, I remember we had some cakes and kind of a goodbye, end of summer graduation. And they said, when are you guys leaving? I said, what do you mean, when are you guys leaving? I said, well, you're obviously not sticking around, right? He says, we live here. We live in Dorchester. They couldn't believe it. They were preparing themselves for abandonment, yet another abandonment. And that was another moment where I felt, all right, these are the expectations we built. People come, they pass through, they get a little experience. We think it's about the people we serve, but really it's about us. And they expect and prepare themselves not to get too attached to us because they will be abandoned. And there's no solidarity of a community anymore. So those are different moments that eventually, here I am, 48, still doing this work. You know, that I think what we have in our society, and now I work with a whole new group of pastors, PICO. It's a national, very big organizing project. There's a young pastor named Pastor McBride. He's from Oakland, California. He's a good friend of Michelle Alexander, which is a book I highly recommend, The New Jim Crow. He met her under unfortunate circumstances. He was on a summer vacation from Duke Theological School, or Divinity School. He was a junior pastor in San Jose and was basically stopped by the San Jose police on the highway. She's a youth pastor. And during the stop, he was sexually assaulted by the police, right, the way he was treated. And his church hired a lawyer. She was a young defense lawyer named Michelle Alexander. And that's how they became lifelong friends. And we worked with her. We work with other people around the country. So churches and faith, and that's another thing. It's important to bridge sometimes not just what you come from, what's your perspective, but bridge with knowing what the culture is and supporting other faiths and other groups, as long as people believe in doing the right, that what you believe is the right thing to do. It doesn't matter what group they're from. In between working in Dorchester, I also took a few sabbaticals where I worked with a peace camp in Israel and Palestine, worked at Harvard on water issues, refugees, and Jerusalem. 93, 94, 95 were pretty optimistic times. The Irish, who the Institute ended up training twice in Belfast. The Irish were jealous how we, quote unquote, were able to solve our conflict, right? And we now know that the Irish have done a lot better than us in the Middle East. And I believe, my analysis is, my personal experience, we were arrogant in the Middle East, right? The peace camp in Israel often despised the settlers, and we looked down on our Arab neighbors, who recently was the president of Israel, Shimon Peres, said, and he thought he was saying a good thing, he said, we will bring the brains and you will bring the bodies, and together we will have a flourishing Middle East. Well, I don't need to explain much about what's wrong with that statement, right? And the head of intelligence for the Israeli army, Teny Gross, before he retired to a really successful business career, he gave a talk at Tel Aviv University, and he said, this was 95. And he said, stop telling the Palestinians how much better they're doing than the Jordanians or the Egyptians or the Syrians, that they make 4 times what they make. They look at us, we're their neighbors, and we make 5 times what they make. So paradoxically, and that's very important, as many of us who have good instincts for peace and we like the ceremonies, we love the getting together, the peace process in Israel actually made Palestinian economy much, much worse. It was not proof, and it did not predict what the opponents will do. It predicted maybe what the opponents on both sides will do, but not what consequences will happen. So what do I mean by that? You could predict that there will be some people who would oppose on both sides strongly to an agreement. So you could maybe predict there will be suicide bombs, which a student at BS8, engineering student, they call him El Mohandes, the engineer, Yihya Yash, indeed helped fabricate those bombs, and they started exploding. So what it was, the Israelis' response, we started putting checkpoints. So you have a peace process where before you did not have checkpoints. Now you have checkpoints. Now you cannot go and get your job for where the market is a lot stronger, which is Israel. See, again, I'm generalizing, I really don't know you, but I'll generalize on myself. We peace-loving people are romantic. And really sometimes peace is much more relevant also with very concrete things like income. If a father cannot bring food on the table in that society, particularly fathers who came and were day laborers, etc., all the talk about peace and all the ceremonies and all the CNN and White House signatures mean nothing. And we failed and actually Jews are considered intelligent, we failed in imagination. This was a very solvable conflict. Vast majority of both sides knew 95% of what the agreement should be. But we sometimes have a superiority because we are the kind people, we are the peacemakers. We think we are better than those who are the warmongers. And that applies to liberals in America, it applies everywhere. So those are lessons for all of us. I look at myself always as sort of a warrior peacemaker. I got to outwork those who are causing violence, whether it's gang members, whether it's the NRA, whether it's Hamas, whether it's the settlers, right? We got to outwork them. Peace, Usually it takes 5 times, I mean, it's a number I'm getting out of my finger, it's not a scientific number. You gotta outwork with peace 5 times what it takes with one bullet to push on the opposite direction. It's just harder. I was today visiting 3 major offenders in maximum security, spent 3 hours, 1 hour with each, and they've lost more young people than I knew as a soldier. And they're here in our cities, in America. And they're trying to figure out how to build peace. But they have so much loss. Violence is so quick to reverse the result. The same as I was a proud part of the Israeli peace camp, every time a suicide bomb went off, for 3 days I was paralyzed. I couldn't almost talk to no one. I was angry myself. I was doubting myself. That's what violence does. That's what it's supposed to do. It takes a long, and that's another thing. We expect people to quit cold turkey. Just do the right thing. Just choose the right thing. Just tell the cops who shot you. It's much more difficult, really, to make those changes. So, from Boston, I went then to Harvard Divinity School. I was really burnt out, to be honest. I didn't go to get educated. I didn't go to Harvard Divinity School to become a minister. I needed a rest. This is a high burnout job, working with gang members. You're almost being shot. I had guns pulled on me as well as my co-worker. We lost in 2 years 75% of our street workers in Boston, just burnt out. We were making $18,000. I was evicted 3 times, just for income. People were benefiting from us reducing violence and gentrifying the neighborhood. So while you're trying to help people, you yourself can't protect yourself. And I'm glad I went. The church allowed me to continue drawing income and do some outreach on a lower scale, which was wonderful. It's a gift I'll never be able to repay. And from there I was recruited. I wrote an editorial in 2001 on gentrification and reduction of violence, where I said a few things. I studied Adam Smith at Harvard, and everyone was saying, Teny, you cannot argue with gentrification, it's the free market. I said, well, it wasn't the free market that brought the violence down. The markets weren't involved in what was going on in the gang violence. It was priests, street workers, gang unit officers, and probation paid by the government that made the difference. And I'm quoting a real estate agent telling me, Teny, calm this neighborhood down. I'm dying to show it. So that was, and I concluded, which is still, I hold true, unfortunately, that unfortunately I'm thinking that a violent drug dealer is the best guarantee for affordable housing that we have, not us liberals with good intentions. So that's something we will have to overcome, all of us, if we're... And I just had a phone conversation driving here with a neighborhood that's being gentrified now in Providence, and how we're trying to solve it. And there really aren't any great solutions, because our society is very much around funding and financing. So it still is a dilemma in many neighborhoods. So I was recruited by a Catholic nun who is heavy in your prayers and your thoughts, because 14 years later she's in hospice. She's not going to make it. She's an amazing woman, Sister Ann Keefe. Started 20 organizations. Really, Harvard Business School should have written about her. And Shkol and Ashoka, all these people give awards. The 20-something-year-old should have given her an award. Because she started an arts organization, started a housing organization, community boating for inner city kids to do boating. She started a Nonviolence Institute. She is quite an amazing woman. And a Catholic priest. They started the Institute for Nonviolence, and one of them, the Institute now is really, Eric Holder looks at what we do. You have people from around the country in Oakland and California and Chicago and Newark looking at what we do. But sometimes it's accident. It's not brilliant design that happens. So what you had is they wanted to do nonviolence, to teach nonviolence. But they made a mistake. They hired a street worker to run a training organization, right? So that's going to be pretty difficult. So eventually what happened is we took my skills and we took their skill and married them. So now we have nonviolence and street workers. So street workers are usually former gang members, so I'm not the typical case, but there's always exception. Many former gang members who actually become peacemakers, which is very usual in the Middle East, it's very usual in Belfast, in Guatemala and Salvador, it actually makes sense. But here, you've got a criminal record. But we have more people in jail than any other society on the planet. Why not recycle human capital? Right? And that's what we do. Now, it's not an easy workforce. We have 4 people on our staff that committed homicides. Right? But their chances of relapsing are a lot lower than if you hire someone who actually had alcohol issues. That's our track record. The Institute actually discriminates. We actually usually don't hire people who had drug or alcohol issues. We will hire killers just because of the issue we work with. You know, we work with violence. We work with people who have influence that way. And they have much lower relapse than people who are involved. Now, there's people, the organization that specialize in rehab and all of that, so they do that. There's people who specialize in domestic violence. We deal a lot with gang and gun violence. That's what we focus on. But so the Institute, I'll quickly say, we have 5 departments. We have a nonviolence training department. Recently, 4 of our staff went to Ferguson. They teach in maximum security. They teach in the police academy. They teach in the community. It's something Eric Holder came to see. It's really powerful when you take a philosophy that was made famous in the United States in the 60s. It wasn't started in the 60s. It actually started by Jesus. And went on and on and on, but that it's adopted now to black on black, Latino on Latino, Asian on Asian, white on white violence, gang violence. It's adopted to gang violence. Because gang member says, this non-violent stuff will get me killed. So you gotta really adapt it to the culture, and they do workshop in juvenile jails, and it's powerful. And the lead trainer, the director of our training department, is someone who has been in jail for a homicide and spent time in maximum security and was exposed to nonviolence, and he is really a powerful teacher. We have the street worker programs. We have victim services. There was another accident. An organization that was mainly in the suburbs supporting victims of homicide collapsed, and their board asked us to take it over. And we were very nervous about it because we're very offender friendly. We worked with victims, but they're caught in the cycle of violence. But these people who are not caught in anything, they're just innocent. We really didn't work with them. So we have the victim services, and we have upstairs a room of those who have died in Rhode Island. We serve the whole state. So we have a doctor who was murdered by his gay lover. He's in his 50s, a very prominent doctor. You have a gang member. So they're all there together supporting each other. Their families are supporting each other. We go to trials, we help with burial, we change laws. In the past in Rhode Island, you had to clean your loved one's remains. You couldn't get counseling if you turned 18. So a lot of things that with the victims, we change the laws in Rhode Island, and it's a daily work. People do pleas. We work on security in the court so that both sides don't. A lot of conflicts actually escalate after trials. So there's a lot of detailed work that has to happen to keep things from deteriorating. And then we have an employment and education. We have our own in-house, and that's something we did successfully in Boston. In the summers, we have year-round employment program. It's very, very important. You have a professor at Harvard, Julius Wilson, who came from Chicago, a seminal book in the 80s, When Work Disappeared. A lot of it is about unemployment. There's Deva Praja wrote a book 2 or 3 years ago. A white man with a criminal record gets more calls back from an employer than a black person with no record. Facts are just the facts, you know. And when I sit today with 3 young men who are hoping to be paroled, I've known them for 5, 6 years, and I'm thinking to myself, the key is going to be someone going to hire them when they come out. It's the key. They come with great intentions. Oh, they want to be free. They want to stay free. But how many of us will be able to do anything if our dignity doesn't get rewarded on Friday, if we cannot buy bread, cannot pay the simple things. How many of us? And we've got to do better as a society. This is not about charity, it's about self-preservation. So those 5 programs really, those are the programs. I described to you programs. And non-profits always describe programs. And to funders, we talk about impacts. Well, it's a lot of nonsense. What really is important when you run an organization, a part of an organization that has a soul. And so the Institute, if you actually ask what the Institute is about, it's about kindness. Well, those 5 programs are excuses and different entryways into kindness, into relationship. So when I walked as a street worker and I had short hair, and when I had the short hair I looked like a total detective when I was 20 years younger. I walk on Wainwright Park, you know the park, and the guys look at me and I was like, get the hell out of here. They use even nastier language. And they threw my card away. I always would walk with cards. But what I did is, the one thing young people did reach out to us was, hey, street worker, you got a job? Now, those who are involved in gangs, the success of accessing and completing programs is very, very low. Very, very low nationally. But you don't think that an 18-year-old young black man in a gang in a crew in a corner is going to ask someone like me when I'm walking there as a street worker, hey, can you offer me a relationship? But that's really what they were meaning. Because you got a job, because that's a legitimate way to connect. But in a way it's saying, I don't want to be here on the block. I'm tired of potentially being shot. But we didn't create a legitimate way to say, hey, can I be connected? The young man today who lost more people, he's 20. And he looks so soft, but he's someone we know for a long time. And he's in for 13 years for shooting someone from a rival neighborhood. And he's been trying, even before he went in, he really started turning, started to create some peace. But when I talked to him today about taking counseling inside, and we had a good discussion about that, but no, I cannot do that. I will not do it. Yes?
When I came to the United States for the first time, I was in Philadelphia, and I was in a neighborhood that was not loved by white population. And I was the only person with a light brown. And maybe it was because of my English in that time, or other reason. I couldn't make that connection with the rest of the neighborhood because
Couldn't or could? You couldn't?
I couldn't, or
Yeah.
I didn't intend to do it. I stayed there for a year, and then I talked to no one except my landlord, who occasionally came to get the rent. I just wonder, with this appearance and accent, or being an outsider of
Yeah.
this society, how did you make that connection? Were you alone when you were on field?
So a few things. It's not unusual, your story, right? I was connected through black churches. I had a purpose. You were living there. It's not a purpose. If someone in your neighborhood organized events together, etc., which I've seen neighborhoods do, people come together. Otherwise, they're foreign to each other. And you are an outsider. You could have been an undercover agent. Often people thought I was an undercover agent, right? But the persistence and who I was with. And so when I was hired as a street worker by the city of Boston, we would come out on the street worker van. And we were dressed, I had a new jacket, street worker. Everyone got daps and hugs. The only one standing twiddling his thumb was me. And I was like, wow, they really love them. I didn't know the cultural habits. I thought, wow, they really love them. And the hugs, to me, looked very sincere. In the Middle East, we shake a hand or something like that. This was big. It turned out really wasn't. It was just the custom. But I showed up in court every morning to see who from my neighborhood got arrested. And I returned every phone call. And I was there every night. And eventually I found out years later that many of the young people in the gangs called me Robocop. They said, Teny doesn't need to sleep. Right? I was there till 3 in the morning. And when I was already in Providence, they came to visit me after a funeral of one of their friends. They said, Teny, there was a story out on the streets that if you connected to Teny, there's a karma, you won't get killed. And I said, Teny, it was true. Because look, people started getting killed when you left. Now, I don't believe in karma at all. But it shows you the power of people's belief when you're committed to them. Right? And who you work with through. And that's why I do not train around the country street workers or volunteers. I believe it needs to be a profession and a field. Right? There's a luxury that I have a team at the Institute. We respond 200 times to 200 calls to the hospital a year. 400 visits. That's a very big undertaking. Volunteers cannot do that. That's dealing with a lot of grief. We get counseling. Right? That requires a professional field. We have a list of the 50 most likely to kill or die in the next 90 days. That's an intelligence operation that the civilians are having, that we as civilian group are having. We have relations with the courts, the hospitals, the police, the school. We need to know what we can share, what we don't want to share. But we're dealing with life and death. Our people have a lot of pressure on them, a lot of pressure on them. When we make a mistake, you know, there's a young man who is now charged for murder, then I'm partially responsible. 2 years ago he came out, he's been waiting, he came out of jail, I saw him in jail. He was someone who was killed 6 years ago and they put 32 pints into him. The head surgeon of Hasbro Hospital came on a Saturday, operated on him, put 32 pints. I never heard such a quantity into a human, into a child. He was 16 or 15. Fast forward 10 years later, he's coming out of jail, white kid, part of a housing project. And he was serious. He was in a training place. He was serious to get into an employment program like we discussed when he was in jail. He was serious about his education, College Unbound, which is a program 7 of our staff are in. And guess what? I was cutting staff and cutting staff, and I didn't feel secure that I could put people on our payroll for the employment program. And he lost hope. He was very persistent for 4 or 5 months. Very persistent. Young, still very young. Very persistent. And all his hope shattered. Gone back into the streets, selling. A year later, they run into the enemy in a gas station, and a fight caught on camera. And then he ends up using the guy that attacked him, using his car to run him over. And there were like 15 of them, but he's the driver. And I see it on the video. And partially it's my fault in this case. There's cases that are pretty clear. I had legitimate fear. We went down from 40 to 15 staff. That's why I don't sleep at night now. I don't work directly as much with young people. I'm now in charge of making sure the people who are working with them are secure. And that's the thing, we don't have a field yet. So it takes a lot of things. I mean, you need empathy, you need good neighborhood. In Providence, there's 2 semi-professors. One of them doesn't pay taxes, so he always keeps his income low. But they're great organizers in the neighborhood, and they make the most diverse, genuine communities. So it's doable. But this society is not great at it. I'm not saying other societies are great at it. But this one, in many ways, this is an amazing place in the United States, but in terms of really getting people, you know, there's a certain percentage, the New York Times and others have shown that when their neighborhood gets diverse, people are fleeing. So those are the realities we're dealing with. But I think if you had a purpose, you were connected through something like a church, an organization, a job, people open up. But initially, people are, who are you? You know, and makes sense. Every time you, as a government, you use an undercover. Every time you use something to not be completely honest to someone, those stories stay for a long time. So I'll give you an example. There was a young woman, Jennifer Rivera. She was 15. She witnessed a murder in Providence in 2000. And one afternoon, she went to get an ice cream. She heard an ice cream truck, and she gave to a young man who was 10 $1. She gave him $1. He was holding her hand, and someone came and executed her in front of that 10-year-old. The 15-year-old was going to testify the next day in a murder trial, and the guy was in jail, but he got his half-brother to kill her. That 10-year-old young man, that was the second murder he saw. When he was 18, his best friend was killed outside of his house on the same corner, Congress Street. He became a leader for a very ferocious Dominican gang, C Block, Congress Street. When by the time he was 18, 3 people were murdered in front of him. It's a lot of trauma. He's been working the last 3 years through us in a theater company. He's very talented. He was killed 3 years ago and brought back to life by the hospital. And then we just didn't leave the hospital room for a week. We just camped there because there was a conflict. And here's another example to your story. There was a conflict between 2 Dominican gangs that live in the same neighborhood. There's no way you can separate them. You go to a pizza store, you go to a Dominican restaurant, you go to the supermarket, you go to the liquor store, you get your gas. You ain't gonna separate these 2 crews. We had like 10 shootings a week sometimes. They all slept at each other's houses as children. It started with a paintball gun on Halloween. And then a stabbing on a school bus. And eventually someone went to jail and brought back and knew how to get a gun. And once you have guns involved, so that's a horrific conflict that we managed to mediate and calm by and large. But his arch rival that shot him is a kid who is 120 pounds, 130 pounds, small kid. He's in his 20s now. He came from the Dominican Republic in a middle school in the neighborhood. Kids bullied him so bad, turned cigarette on his arm. No one did anything about it. The adults were too busy and too understaffed. So his dad comes, so he then eventually joins this gang, right? He's bullied. You join usually the gang that bullies you, by the way, not some rival. But immediately you gain everyone else's, all their enemies. And one day they're in a party not far, maybe less than a mile from where we are, and his friends get shot, and he drives him to the hospital, and he literally dies in his hand at the reception area. And he goes crazy. And he and the mother of the victim for the next 3 years hunt the other team. They hunt them. Literally, they hunt them. With the dad was sent back to the DR and back and forth. Eventually he does a shooting. He goes to check a cash on Friday with the mother, and he sees 2 rivals in a car in front of our building. He doesn't know what our building is because he was gone. And he shoots them in front of us. And I go and see him. I tell to the gang leader, you got to surrender him tomorrow. And he does. He surrenders him. And I go and see him. So the next day, he tries to commit suicide in segregation. He's segregated, tries to commit suicide. And I go and see him, and he's, jumpsuit, handcuff, all the handcuffs, the ones you cannot really move. He's in a cell, we can't even, but we're talking, he's crying. It's like, Teny, I have a 1-month-old baby. I don't want him to fight their babies when they're older and they don't even know what it's about. Just so much grief and pain in our young people. His dad comes when he was on the run. Sweet, kind, soft man. And he's crying in my office. He says, Teny, I feel so bad for the parents of the other side. I feel so bad for us. I says, what happened? I brought such a sweet kid to what I thought was a better opportunity. And then he told me the bullying stories, the cigarettes. He says, this is an uneducated Dominican parent, very poor, who leaves his roots, come over here. He says, I drive a yellow bus. He says, this is such a violent society, he says. In broken English, right? He says, this is such a violent. He says, you should see, people talk about my son again, you should see what those kids are allowed to do. And where are the adults, he asked me. He's broken. Because it doesn't get in the advertisement. For those of us who are immigrants, we think America is something very different. We think this is the promised land in many ways. And he comes in and says, what happened to my son? I love his broken English like it was my mother's, broken Hebrew. He said, I brought a sweet kid to this country. What happened? Right? So I want to stop because it's just kind of a monologue, so ask me questions. No? Is that bad? Yes, sir.
I've got a lot of questions. I'm really interested in the model of the street worker, the professional street worker.
Yeah.
And how you train somebody to be a street worker, and whether ministers could see themselves as street workers.
I don't think they need to see themselves as street workers. You can train ministers. They have a role. Pastor Jeff Brown is great. He's here in Boston. He can train people, and we can help. I think pastors have a role as pastors. Former gang members have a role as former combatants or peacemakers. I think there's some overlap, right? But I think we need to be what we are in the same way. I think that there's many pastors. I was just in Chicago, and there's some very famous pastors who are doing great work around peace and organizing. Not to mention the pastors have to bury the dead, and they counsel the families. So they have a big role that they have. It's just different than a street worker, and that's fine. Just like a good police officer has a really good role, too. A good police officer can help bring peace. And any one of those roles, you can be corrupt and actually bring war. You can be a corrupt cop, you can be a corrupt pastor, you can be a corrupt street worker that doesn't return your calls. So we all, in every role we have in a society, we can enhance. The role itself doesn't do good or bad. It's how you push
That's
it.
part of what I'm interested in is what pastors can learn from street workers in terms of really being the pastor of a community, not just a church.
Right. Well, I think one important thing that I think taints pastors as well is we're a very judgmental society, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the commandments, if I'm a murderer, if I'm using violence, I want you to stop. Well, really, I think we want to pull someone back. It's a process. So if I'm an addict, nationally it takes 6 times to get clean. If I'm a domestic violence victim, it takes 9 times on average to get out. But in the past, people used to blame, cops used to say to them, oh, she had it coming, and they told the guy, sober up and knock it off. We didn't actually charge people for domestic violence, right? With gang members, and as a society, we often judge minority communities that are under siege of violence, that they are immoral. They won't corroborate in a trial. But good cops know, good prosecutors know, and street workers and good clergy know that the pressure during trial is huge. There is a code of the street. Now, rather than blame the code of the street, and I don't want to sound crazy liberal, forgiving all of that. We push against that, but I'm just trying to portray a little bit more the other side of it. The code of the street exists because many of us acted in illegitimate ways that created a vacuum. If we couldn't produce equality of employment, and too many people had to make a living in ways that break the law of our society, and had to survive, and to do that, to live outside the law, as Bob Dylan says, it's very, very hard. Now, he meant it in different ways. When you try and change society, subvert it. Bless you. But when you break the law, you know you broke the law, and you live outside of the law, and now you potentially start to lie, and you have to hide, and now you see the cops who maybe lied, or you heard stories of that, and you start to have illegitimate feeling about the law, and you have been wrong, because you're poor. I was in court last Wednesday for somebody. While we're waiting, a man was all scruffy, kind of homeless, gets dragged in front of a judge. And they were going to keep him for a week. Basically, it's over $40 on driving without a license. Now, he has a history of drug. He says, I had a meeting today, he said, with my probation officer to get a place in Woonsocket, another city, in a rehabilitation house. And he was going to go in for a week. He said, all right, you know, a surety, $400 will be $40. He says, but Your Honor, I was going to meet with my probation officer. I don't think I can come up with $40. So we were going to pay $300 a day for a bed, for him to be there another week. And you know, is he a trickster? Possibly. He's homeless. He's not doing well. But when the defendant walked out, I just called her to my bench. I said, I'll pay the $40. I mean, it was like feeling I'm in a Dickens story. But that's what we are. Go to court. You want to educate yourself? Spend a day in court, any court in Boston. You got to, if you're a student in Boston, that's another thing. So few students actually venture into the other world. There are two Americas. Unfortunately, there's two Americas. And that's extreme when you're like, some people will not like it. But, you know, I was amazed how many students this is the largest, it used to be the largest concentration of student in the world, is Boston. Didn't know other parts of life. And all it takes is take the tea and go and sit in the court. See what people are being dragged there for. See the human misery. And ask yourself, are we better than the barbarians we think lived 3,000 years ago? You know, it will humble us about our achievements. And we have a lot of achievements. In 100 years, we doubled our life expectancy. Every time I take a shower, I am a happy human being. Because it sure does beat going for a mile to drink a cold bucket of water and scraping yourself the way they did during Shakespeare's time. Right? So, I love showers. Shower, what a miracle. Just doing the gas thing and putting the grill on, that's amazing. I'm grateful for technology. But in some ways, we're savages. The Ebola thing shows it immediately, whoa. You know, all our solidarity. So it's work in progress. For us to be civilized, it's a thin veneer. We got to work harder at it. So I think one is really for pastors to learn that it's a process. The young men, when you offer them a job and got them in, or it's a young woman, and they didn't show up to work, they were fired or they got arrested for drug, get off your ego. They didn't let you down. They let themselves down first. Right? So on one level, this is, all this work is not about our ego, which is hard. I have an ego. I like to hear myself talk. You see, you're all falling asleep, right? I'm enjoying myself. But you know, on one level, it really isn't. They're not letting you down. And I had many gang members say, Teny, we were trying to let you down and everyone else at the institute, so we changed. That's great. But it's not about us. It's helping them and knowing. I like that if we can approach it from a humble position. You know, in high school, I used to wake up at noon. So I tell them, it's nothing unusual that you're sleepy and not the most motivated when you're young. But here's the reality. You have a record, you are black, you live in a poor neighborhood, and the kids across the highway there have been read to since the age of 0. So you're behind on the competition. And I'm going to be honest with you because I want for you what I want for my kids. And but you got it. People will listen to that construction criticism if it comes from a place of love. Very often, young people shut themselves off from us because they just hear the criticism. But our young people are very, very traumatized. So Patrick Sharkey went to Brown, Harvard PhD, teaches at NYU. He's less than 30. He looks like he's 20. He looked at kids in Chicago in elementary and middle school. No research, he didn't do any tests. He just took the school tests in math and literacy. It's not literacy, whatever it's called in elementary and middle school, 2005 and 6. In a neighborhood where you had 12 homicides, it's sort of the size of Providence, 180,000. They didn't know the homicide victim, right? It's 180,000 people. That's the size of a neighborhood in Chicago. The first week, across the board, the kids tank on their tests. Tank. They don't know the murder victim. There's something in the air in their neighborhood. Then they bounce back. Their young brains, their elementary and middle school, their brains are very agile. So now they're gathering funding for the next phase of the research, which is going to answer one question. Or really, I have another question. The one question is, does the agile brain of a child, after all those traumas, that are not direct traumas, by the way, right? These are environmental big traumas. This is not the kids of the family. At what point the agility stops to be agile? Then there's another question. If education is built on the knowledge you just gained, right? You build it on something. You don't do calculus at third grade, and then do some basic stuff in 11th grade, right? It builds upon itself. What happens when you have holes of a quarter every month? At what point just what you lost becomes impossible to catch upon, right? But those are very simple things. Our society researches, the biggest grants now do not go to frontline workers. They go to researchers and evaluators. It is a new neoliberal way to keep people under the boot by foundations and educated people like us. When we talk about the new flavor of the month and the new project, right? It's almost like saying America is going to run its wars from the Pentagon. Right? It's not a good, but this is because we spend so much money on military rather than having frontline soldiers with all the technology. And that's how we're trying to change violence. Right? Those who are on the front line trying to engage. And I think that love and relationship is a really powerful tool, but you need bodies. So the work of the Institute and another person who came from Boston, David Kennedy, at the National Network of Safe Communities, at John Jay, and other people, our work has been researched. It is on top of the list for the Justice Department. It's proven program. We have the medicine, we have the antibiotics. What we don't have is the right dosage. Right? So you shouldn't take antibiotics for 3 days. It will actually make your illness resistant. So the question foundation don't ask is, they ask what's the best practices. They don't ask actually how long do we need, how to support it. So my dream has been, since my days in Boston, I work with colleagues around the country, is to build a field that is sustainable. Right? That you can join a career, and we lost the best people to become probation officers, get government jobs. Because there is no stability, and there's almost no one my age doing this work. Right? I'm 48 with a Harvard degree. I had 2 board members put a down payment so I can have a house, literally in August. That's not normal. I have 2 other people from the community lend me money to buy a car at $3,500. It's not a sob story about me. It is about how we have a field that is not sustainable. You cannot attract and keep good people in this field. And we need to change it. So rather than always ask about what do we do about the kid, so a lot of us who know how to, we need to build a field that we can keep good. It's about creating talent. What would be the NFL what would be violence if we had the money of the NFL, and what would be the NFL if they had our money? Simple. All right? You would have sort of the second league in Spain, where the person is a part-time accountant and part-time, which is actually a great league, right? But it's not Messi and and Ronaldo. They're full-time. That's what they do. So.
What are the questions you have?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Could you tell us more about your own personal conversion to nonviolence, and maybe give us a better understanding of what your definition of nonviolence is?
So, it's a process. We start every meeting at the Institute, whether it's a board meeting, senior staff, or all staff, with how did you practice nonviolence this week? Every one of our cards, and these packets, they have my card, every staff member I've voted on the back of the card has the 6 principles and the 6 steps. And one of the things we say to each other and outside is none of us is nonviolent. I don't think you become nonviolent. So for me, if we're looking at the addict, I'm from someone who went on to see the F-16, the first F-16 come to Israel, went to that ceremony, went then to the hangar where they parked them and look at this beautiful bird, which is now I know a bird of destruction. Someone at 16 was a sniper. I use an Uzi and an M16. To someone who dislikes these things. Now, it's a process. Am I a pacifist? I'm not a pacifist. But between being a pacifist and being a regular warmonger, there's a lot of good you can do. Now, I hope to be one day a pacifist, but it still is a problem. But I'm very far from where I was. Our gang members that work for us now, and I would trust, if I die, I would trust my children into them. Some of them are not pacifists, but they've gone a very far way. And they've been tested harder than many of us. So, nonviolence is really, I think, another thing that happens with violence, with guns, is it reduces your mental and verbal faculties. All right? So, there's a movie, I think it's an Indiana Jones, where the guy starts to do this in front of Harrison Ford, he kind of pulls the guns and shoots him. It's a great statement on nonviolence. If I have a gun, why do I need to talk to you? So the Israeli Defense Force started as a defense force. We came from the Holocaust, we're going to just defend ourselves. But you use the tool of violence, you don't know where it's going to end up. And that's what we tell gang members too. You want to cause revenge. You know where you're going to shoot. Let's say you know who killed your friend. You can control that, maybe. Maybe. Sometimes a girl gets ended up killed, a 9-year-old, right? But let's say you don't know, you can unleash violence. You cannot control who they're going to unleash it back on and what that's going to cause. So one of the things at Harvard was an amazing class by a Jesuit, Father Hare. It's the just war theory. So Christianity started as a pacifist philosophy. St. Augustine did what they call now the Augustinian move. You still cannot defend yourself. If you come to kill me, I cannot defend myself. But if you come to kill him, I'm allowed to kill him. That was the little opening that 1,500 years later ended up in Hiroshima. And for me, that's not violence. Being very conscious of doing a little discount, a little qualification, and knowing that we're all infallible, that we can end up in Hiroshima. So I don't have exactly the good answer how to be pacifist, like Jesus, but I'm well aware and humble that just the Augustinian move can end up in a Hiroshima. So, bless you. Another important definition for me of nonviolence, it really messes up with your innocence. It's a cruel tool. So I drive now in Israel when I go and see my family and friends. And I think here was a Palestinian village. Here was this, here was that. It robs you a little bit of a simple joy, potentially. Because, and in a way it can make you insane. So you got a quantum, like for example, am I bothered every time an ant gets driven over by a car here? No, but if I was a really intense Peter Singer, I would. But there's a limit how many battles I can handle. I mean, I got to trust my fellow human beings that someone else is going to fight on how we raise chickens. That I'm not going to do that. Now, it's not that it's less important. It is just knowing that I'm limited in what I can do. You're not doing gang violence, so you're going to let me do that, but you're going to do the chickens. So it's sort of coming to terms also with our limitation as human beings, that we, I'm interested in the environment and global warming. I did a walk with Amica Insurance with the CEO, and he told me how, these are usually Republicans, but they have no doubt it's global warming because they're adjusting the insurance. So, but is this what I do day to day? No. But I'll support people who do that. So sometimes it's also a certain humility, and there's complications in what we do. You know, at some point, my success at the Institute can disempower black people from the community raising their own organization. This is not a simple, you know, I always sort of felt, there was an English officer that was told his story, inspired me as a kid, Ot Wingate. They trained us how to defend ourselves before Israel was born, 20, 30 years, right? It will be controversial now, but he called himself the friend. Man, he said, I'm not going to fight the Jewish fights for your liberation, but I'll train you. So I feel very often we build systems like social workers are going to save black kids and Latino kids. This is wrong. Now, we have no right as a community to say, well, you solve that problem because we don't want to intervene in your affair. No, we're all of us are worth the same. Right? That's, to me, another thing with nonviolence. Our goal at the Institute is that every skin color, every person is worth exactly the same. And that's a very difficult one to do in our society. Right? And at the moment, every skin color is not worth the same. And that's a fundamental problem. And it's a dangerous problem because people die because of that. You know, my skin color is a security blanket. Not perfect, but I'm a lot safer in this society. So that's something we're trying to change. I think there's another goal I didn't talk about. I think if I look at my arc of work last 25 years, it's to reduce homicide and violence. That's number one. Number two is to create a path for those who are involved in the battle to be peacemakers. It's a very small group of people. Not everyone who comes out of jail can be a good street worker. It's a we always say we're the fewer, the prouder than the Marines, right? Street workers are more select group than the Marines. It takes a lot of savvy, risk-taking, intelligence, commitment. It's an unbelievable, it's a camaraderie, it's a brotherhood and sisterhood around the world. It's very small. When we see each other, we're very proud. Because we take risks. We have guns pulled on us with no weapons, just our mouths. And that takes a lot of skill. But the third priority is actually to make the police part of the beloved community. Mm-hmm. In this country, and I know it because I come from somewhere, police, to white people, I'm generalizing. A lot of this talk is generalized, right? Forgive me. It's an hour and a half. You can be very subtle in a lot of ideas you're trying to throw. But for white people, generally, cops will say, oh, good, I have safety now. The cops are here. For a black person, seeing a cop is actually the opposite. So bringing them, working with cops around the country, which we do and others do, is to help those leaders within policing that recognize that. And clergy are involved with that and others. So I'll quote Chief Bratton. Bratton came from Boston, was the chief in Boston. Was a chief in NYPD, was a chief in LAPD. Tough assignments. He's back in New York, he's 66. He said 3 months ago at the Ford Foundation, there were 30 of us, including the mayor of New York. There was chief from Chicago, LA, some clergy. Small group of people who are pushing this field. And he said, this is my last assignment, I'm 66. Now, he is what Michael Jordan is to basketball, Bratton is to policing, just so you have a perspective, right? He is a world-famous chief of police. He said, in the last 50 years, we treated black people like they're non-citizens. That's a major statement for a major chief of police. So it's not some liberal here in a t-shirt telling you that. This is just an issue recognized. So those are fundamental issues. The good news is some people are recognizing it now, and there's work to be done. So some of us also in the camp of peace, we like to be, we're the good people, trust us, but we do this by vilifying the other one, like the cops. Oh, I'm with you. You gang members are really hard. No. Yeah. You should not be shooting people. With all racism, slavery, everything that is in here, you should not be shooting at people. And not all cops are bad. So we do at the Institute, when I employ, we bring people from the police and gang members to sit and discover each other. And it's so powerful. Sal, our director of training, does a circle where you get a random question. You have to answer the next question next to it. It's amazing. And he had mayors in it, with cops, with gangers, with gang members. It's phenomenal what he does to a room. Humanizing, just bringing kind, seeing each other in a different light. All right?
Any one last question?
ask you a question?
There's one right behind you.
Okay.
The
So
young
you,
blood gang member. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So you focus primarily on, or do you focus primarily on people coming out of jail, or do you try to get into schools and focus on young children?
Great question. If I look at my tenure at the Institute, not a great success in getting into school. We had the model was expensive, right? 2 trainers per classroom. Not a good model. You really need to get some teachers, train them, and then they stay in that school. So the model wasn't really great. Teachers, schools in the last 15, 20 years with no kids left behind, no child left behind, have been pushed on those 2 measurements, math and literacy, that everything else, music, theater, nonviolence, has just gone by the wayside. My argument, as a taxpayer in Providence, I pay $150,000 per kid for 12 years of education. I think I would like that kid to be able to read, to do math, and be civilized. Right? The 3rd leg of the stool. Right? Why do you read great literature like Dostoevsky, like Shakespeare, like Chinua Achebe? Why do you read that? You don't read it to figure out the writer's literary devices. A great book is always a moral debate. I love Old Man and the Sea. I've seen people, I've read it at 14, I've seen great people who are like these gorgeous fish, who by the time our political process and media process ends dealing with them, their skeletons showing up on the shore. This is a real story. It's about a fish and an old Cuban fisherman, but really it's about a metaphor on what we do to people who try and change society. Right? So we have emptied meaning out of our education. Without imagination, there's no beauty. We become so utilitarian. You need to be somewhat utilitarian. It's a great strength of American utilitarianism, pragmatism. But love and power and imagination, why do we have ambition? Why do we learn? Why are we curious? That doesn't happen if you don't have imagination, if you don't teach those things. So we have not been gratefully successful in school. We've had AmeriCorps that does, and it really does great work in school. And we try and do prevention, but as we shrunk, we ended up being ambulance chasers. We ended up at the hospital at 2 in the morning. It takes a toll on you. But ultimately, what we're trying to do now with the newer push, with the new governor and the new mayor that we have, that we did a training for politicians in nonviolence, and she took it when she was a candidate. She was a treasurer of the state. Now she's the governor. She's going to be the governor in January. She, like, most people don't really know what nonviolence means. And we're not great at explaining it. She took a 1-day training with others, and it really hit her. Because there's a great opportunity to what we are trying to do. There's a real emptiness in our society. We know things are not right. We're not, as a taxpayer, paying $300,000 for a bullet of uncompensated care is not a good way, if you're a Republican, to talk about efficiency of your capital. If you are locked up in high security, bless you, in Rhode Island, if you are locked in high security, we spend $200,000 a year. If you're in Max, where I was today, it's $100,000. We could do a lot better things with $100,000 per person. We're paying for failure, both Republicans and Democrats. So there's a real opportunity for us to articulate a new vision, and it works. The beautiful thing for me with meeting with funders, the return on investment at the Institute is no one can match it. I mean, the savings we do when we save a life or mediate a gang conflict saves the state of Rhode Island millions of dollars.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.